Hi, thank you guys for joining me. My name is Jacob Richards. I'm here at the Mesa County Library, and I'd like to thank Priscilla with the Mesa County Historical Society for organizing this. I also would like to thank Ike for being the history guru down here, not just for setting this up, but also for pointing me in the direction. The man is a resource for all of us, and I'd like to thank him personally for all his help he's given me in this project. I'm going to explain just a couple of photos on this first slide. The first photo is from the 1971 Grand Junction steel strike, a long, bitter labor dispute that involved federal mediators. The middle photo is a man getting arrested in the infamous 1978 pot riot that happened in Lincoln Park. And the third photo is from Denver, and it's a protest march being led by Iraq vets against the war. And in the first row, third from the left, is a man named Garrett Rappenhagen, who joined the military here before 9/11 and became a very dissident soldier speaking out against the war while he was still serving and when he returned. And I think that kind of gives us a good scape of what we're going to be covering today. Before we get started, I really need to do a land acknowledgement that this whole narrative takes place on stolen land. And I think it's important to really look at like the first progressive movement in the Grand Valley being the close to 400 years of resistance and resistance for autonomy from Spain, Mexico, and the United States. The final Ute removal really kind of took place after the Battle of Milk Creek in 1879 and the Meeker Massacre, massacre in quotes, and that eventually led to the 1881 Ute removal. But our crimes and our original sin of taking the Native Americans' land was not really over here, because from 1886 to 1911, the Teller Indian School operated down on D Road. And the children resisted this, and we need to look at that as a social movement too. And they resisted through multiple escapes, acts of sabotage, and clandestine rituals and native language use, both of which were against the rules of the institution. I think it's also really important to talk about biases and stuff like that. My name is Jacob Richards. Like I said earlier, I moved to Grand Junction when I was 19 in 2000. During my time here, I've been active with many of the protest movements, from A Voice of Reason opposing the Iraq War, to Grand Junction Alternative Media, Housing First No More Deaths, organizing homeless folks, and many others. I kind of took a break from it and got back into activism at the beginning of the pandemic when I formed Grand Junction Mutual Aid and helped organize the first Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. The top picture on this slide is me getting arrested protesting the Iraq War. Dick Cheney was in town. I wanted to have a conversation with him. They didn't want to let me have a conversation with him. The other photo is a front page of The Red Pill, which was an underground newspaper that we ran from 2004 until 2012. And the picture on that issue of it is of two undercover police officers that the GJPD inserted in Housing First No More Deaths. So we kind of start with our narrative now. First kind of radical and organizer in the Grand Valley was a man I'm very fond of. His name was Caro Gleeser. The top photo is a woodblock carving of him. He was instrumental in organizing the Knights of Labor, which was really one of the first large labor organizations. The Knights of Labor in Grand Junction were strong from the very beginning. 1885 was about 4 years into the town's existence. There was about 300 people in town. There was 95 members of the Knights of Labor at that time. That's about 1 in 3 Grand Junction residents were part of the organization. The K of L was organized in time for the first big railroad strike, which happened in 1885, and it almost killed the organization. The strike lost, scab labor replaced the union guys, but the organization did survive, and they went on to form what would be really the first library in town, about 10 years before the Library Association formed the library system we have now. But they really laid the groundwork of class consciousness and ideas of labor versus the ownership classes. And you'd see that influence in the strikes and labor movement through the 1900s and 19-teens. There was other large railroad strikes in 1894, 1908. The United Federation of Mine Workers was kind of the radical mining union at the time, and local coal miners were a part of that, and they walked out in the general strike following the 1914 Ludlow Massacre. It's hard to overstate how much gains we as a country gained from the labor movement, things like the 8-hour workday, basic child labor laws, workplace safety, all these things were non-existent. And Junction to this day has a strong labor movement. And nationally and locally, it's not as strong as it was at the turn of the 20th century, but local number 7 representing grocery workers have gone on numerous large strikes in the 80s and 90s that were long, drawn out, and included acts of sabotage and windows of supermarkets being shut out. So labor is still a strong force and is still a movement in this town. That lower photo is from 1982, local number 7 strike against City Market. Kind of move from the early labor to the progressive movements, or populist movement. These were all kind of part of the progressive era, both the populist movement and the following socialist movement. But here in Grand Junction in the 1890s, the populists were very strong. Populists at this time were leftist in nature, and very much in a direct response to the kind of excesses of the laissez-faire capitalism of the Gilded Age and the robber barons. The populists were closely aligned with organized labor, as well as the suffrage movement, and really were formed between another group and the Farmers Alliance, formed together to form the Populists. Mesa County had a Farmers Alliance starting in 1885. It was a cooperative organization that farmers were able to use to negotiate better freight rates and things like that. At the time of 1894, which was kind of the peak of the Populists, Grand Junction had a populist mayor and a populist newspaper. Colorado had a populist governor and Governor Waite. And one of the town founders, James L. Buckland, was elected twice as a populist to the state senate. You know, and one thing to mention on everybody in history is everybody has something they weren't great on. The populists were very opposed to immigration, especially from Southern Europe, Mexico, and Asia. They were pretty okay with kind of Northern European immigrants. But I want to talk a little bit about the summer of 1894, which was like, I've been calling it the Summer Revolt. So a movement started called the Coxey Movement. A man named Jacob Coxey started a march in 1894 from Ohio to Washington, D.C. At this time, America was in the worst depression of its time. The 1893 silver crash had basically decimated the economy nationwide. And Jacob Coxey had this crazy idea, radical idea for the time, that we should put unemployed men to work fixing the roads. And he was pushing a legislation called the Good Roads Bill. And his was also like the first protest that went viral. So almost instantaneously, different Coxey Army groups started forming up around the country. In the West, this often took the form of train jacking because there wasn't very good transportation. So these armies of unemployed workers would seize trains. A lot of them were unemployed railroad men. They would then drive the trains as fast as they can east to Washington, D.C. to join in this movement. Grand Junction, being at the junction of major transportation hubs, saw a number of these Coxeyite armies come through in 1894. The last one was the most dramatic. The man's name was Frederick Denning Smith. He had come out of the Stockton area of California. He had a hard struggle getting here. They had stolen a train. Their train got put on a siding pretty quickly thereafter, and a marshal tried to arrest him. The marshal shot his second in command, and he intervened to prevent the mob of Coxeyites from lynching the marshal there in California. He then proceeded on foot with a slowly diminishing group of guys as he went, but walked basically from California into Utah. At the Davis County line, the sheriff of Davis County and the chief of police of Salt Lake City met the Coxey Army there with a court injunction forbidding them from entering the county and forbidding them from entering Salt Lake City. And for a few days, a standoff happened, but the radicals in Ogden, which Ogden at that time was a hub of progressive politics, a judge there to kind of move them along issued a warrant for the arrest of the chief of police of Salt Lake City and the sheriff of Davis County, creating kind of a legal crisis that had to go to the courts. Denning Smith's army was kind of the rear guard, the very last straggler group trying to make their way to Washington. And by the time they were trying to leave Salt Lake City for Grand Junction, U.S. Marshals were deployed around the rail system, preventing these kind of train jackings from happening. So they set out from Salt Lake City to Grand Junction on foot, and the army did not fare well. They were described as starving and scattered and in a ragged state. And without the help of Grand Junction citizens, businesses, and even the Sentinel, who was very much opposed to the populist movement, they still put barrels out in front of the Sentinel office to collect supplies and food that we could then send on the trains to these starving men. The picture above, the lower picture is a picture of Denning Smith from a mugshot from later in California in 1902 or so. The picture above shows U.S. Marshals boarding a train from Denver in the Pullman strike of 1894. The Pullman cars were like these luxury sleeper cars on the train. They were manufactured in a factory town. With the collapse of the economy, their pay was cut in half, so they went out on strike. Eugene Debs with the American Railway Union called a sympathy strike, so all the railroads went on strike in sympathy to the workers, with the workers at Pullman. This shut down the nation's rail lines, including here in Junction, and in an effort to get transportation moving again, U.S. Marshals were deployed all over. One marshal left Denver with a train and 600 newly deputized marshals to break this strike. And he ran into some difficulties. When he got into Glenwood, about 100 yards of train track were dynamited by strikers in sympathy. But most of his strike breakers were former railway men, so they stopped the train, rebuilt the track, kept going. They got to Newcastle and another bridge was blown up. So they rebuilt the bridge, rebuilt the train tracks, kept going. They got a little past Newcastle and two small train bridges over some dry arroyos were packed with firewood and lit on fire. And so they stopped and rebuilt those bridges. When they got to Grand Junction, according to Joseph A. Small, U.S. Marshal for Colorado to the Attorney General of the United States, he said, "The conditions of affairs at Grand Junction were extraordinary. My deputies were not only met by the strikers at that point, but by citizens who met in a public hall prior to their arrival and resolved not only to resist the entry of the deputies to the town, but also to give no quarter or sell them anything to eat." So they then had to get on their train back up to Palisade to get resupplied. And it was the Populists that held this public meeting. And the marshals were eventually allowed into the town, and Grand Junction and Palisade and these railroad communities were under martial law for about 10 days during this period. About 9 local strikers were rounded up and hauled to Denver in the middle of the night to stand trial. They were later released with essentially no punishment. Strangely too, these guys who stole trains often got almost no punishment. One group, Spangler out of Cripple Creek, Colorado, stole a train. They kind of strong-armed their way to get free rides all the way from Cripple Creek to La Junta. Then they stole a train, kept heading east. Marshals then wrecked a train on the train tracks to stop them. All these unemployed guys are former train workers, so they got out and they rolled the wrecked engine off the embankment, rebuilt the track, kept going. So the marshals then wrecked a train in a cut bank, so they couldn't roll the engine off the tracks and keep going. So the guys disembarked, walked to the next town, and stole another train. And to put it in perspective on punishment, 3 months later, Spangler is traveling the state stumping for the Populists. So he had a kind of a slap on the wrist, and these people were kind of Robin Hood folk heroes to many Americans at that time. And the Populists lead really directly into the Socialists, and I got a good quote from the Junction Daily News about that. This is from 1899. "The Socialists are quite active in this county and have stolen a large part of the platform of the People's Party," another word for the Populist Party. "Well, the latter were about done with it anyway." And so kind of as the fading star of the Populists faded, the Socialist movement kind of arose out of it. And the Socialists were very much a part of the Populist movement, but they were definitely only one faction of the Populist movement. The Socialist era in Grand Junction has been covered. It's often covered as a brief blip in Junction's history, but when we look at it, the Socialist Labor Party first started organizing in 1898. The Socialists first started publishing a newspaper in 1899. S.B. Hutchinson was the first Socialist elected official in town. He was elected in 1902. And so it was more of a broad, longer-based movement than other histories to give it credit for. The top picture here on this new slide is a man named George N. Falconer. He did a lot of things. He traveled around a lot. He was only in Junction for about 10 years, but he did leave his mark here. He ran a small bookstore. He was a founding member of the Chamber of Commerce. He ran for office. He was a part of the local number 35 of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was like the most radical union at the time, the only union that accepted women and Chinese workers and black workers and things like that. But Hutchinson, who's the lower photo there, he would go on to become America's first socialist chief of police in 1909. Both the socialist and populist movement, we see a lot of influence by town founder James Buckland. Buckland was never really a socialist, but he was heading a movement that kind of bridged both the populists and the socialists, and that was the Municipal Ownership League. And they advocated for the city to own essentials. We see that today in the fact that Grand Junction Water owns Grand Junction Water and not a private corporation, which was debated at the time. In 1909, Falconer, S.B. Hutchinson, James L. Buckland, and a number of these other city leaders sat down and they reworked the town charter, and they instituted ranked choice voting, which is even today kind of this radical thing that a few cities have been playing with. And in 1909, with the ranked choice voting, a number of socialists were elected to city council, including the mayor. And during that time, they would try a lot of really innovative stuff, and they were constantly being heckled by the Sentinel as they tried to do these things. One of the cool things they did get up and running was a woodlot where anybody who was homeless or a hobo or just unemployed could go split wood, get fed. Then this free and cheap wood would be available for poor families to burn to heat their homes. They made a push and passed laws to make it possible for a municipality to own a coal mine. And the plan was to have a municipal-owned coal mine that if at any point, if you were unemployed, you could just go to the coal mine, get paid for work for a day, and then the city could produce low-price coal for the regular folks here in town. They also were working on municipal ownership of the streetcars and municipal ownership of an ice house to help people refrigerate their goods. These kind of basics of life they were trying to have the city own, so it wasn't a profit motive in delivering these essential services. And really the socialist movement, even though they lost power in 1913, would continue on into the 30s. For a while during World War I, there was a lot of backlash and suppression of the socialists locally and nationally, and they kind of moved into a group called the Nonpartisan League, but that political party and movement didn't last but a couple years. And you would see another brief kind of revival of Socialist Party in the 1930s. They ran a full ticket in 1932, which is still to this day something the Democratic Party here is unable to do. There's an awful lot on the socialists, but tell one quick story about their last newspaper. There was a number of socialist newspapers over the time. The New Critic was the last one, and in 1917, the socialists were about the only anti-war voice, saying, no, let's not go fight in the trenches in Europe. Nationally, that became illegal with the Espionage Act and Sedition Act that Wilson passed. And here locally, the kind of suppression came through a group called the Home Guard. When the Colorado National Guard got called up to go fight in Europe, the governor reached out to municipalities and counties and said, raise up some men for a militia so they can kind of take on the role of the Colorado National Guard while the Colorado National Guard is in Europe. And this Home Guard was very disorganized at first, kind of in this gray zone between being an official government agency and being something like a fraternity. But their first real act here in town was to show up at the office of the New Critic with guns and tell them not to be publishing any more of these seditious anti-war articles. No known copies of the New Critic exists after that suppression. I'm going to talk about Dalton Trumbo. In a lot of ways, he kind of bridges the old left of the kind of labor-focused socialist left and the new left of the 1960s. It's hard to say whether Trumbo was influenced by the local socialist movement and their, public suppression. He was only 12 when the newspaper was suppressed, but the poem that I have on this slide was published in 1918 when Trumbo was only 12. So of any 12-year-old who might be reading the newspaper enough to get it, it might be the 12-year-old who's also being published in that newspaper. And really in just a few years from his publication of this poem, Trumbo was working as a cub reporter for the Sentinel. We do know that Trumbo was influenced by both the loyalty leagues during World War I and the KKK in the 1920s. This is from Bruce Cook's biography of Trumbo. The loyalty leagues, if you're not familiar, nobody's really written about them, but they were formed, and there was front page kind of forms that you were supposed to fill out and spy on your fellow citizens and determine whether your fellow citizen was an alien, an enemy alien, an anti-government person, or a patriot. And that was the only 4 categories, and they were actively out there, trying to categorize everybody into what level of patriotism they have. Trumbo's dad was a short member of the Loyalty League, but he quit after there was a number of attacks on German citizens. A German farmer in Orchard Mesa was tarred and feathered. A German merchant downtown had his store smashed up and everything torn apart, looking for secret messages from the Kaiser. So we do know that that kind of the backlash from the socialist area did influence Trumbo. When Trumbo left, it's kind of assumed that he had something kind of like a populist point of view. And Eclipse, his novel about the Grand Valley, really embodies that kind of small town populism. John Abbott is the character in the book. The real life person is Moyer, William Moyer, and he was an active populist and was a part of the city charter convention in 1909 that brought in the ranked choice voting. So that book, in a lot of ways, embodies that kind of small town populism. His other book, his probably most famous book, is Johnny Got His Gun, and it was inspired in a large part by a local World War vet named Roy Chapman. Trumbo worked for Chapman. Chapman was blinded by gas in the trenches, and he would look after both Chapman's store and Chapman. So every morning, his morning routine would include like warming water to put on Chapman's eyes to get him to feel better. And Trumbo is pretty well known. Tons have been written about him. Hollywood movies have been made about his life. But he was a member of the Communist Party. He organized strikes and labor stuff in LA. And he always kind of stood up for the little guy. In 1947, he was called to testify under the House Un-American Activities Committee, and imprisoned for refusing to testify and blacklisted from Hollywood. Eventually, he would work through the blacklist, writing under pseudonyms and nom de plumes. But his book, Johnny Got His Gun, was cited by a number of people I talked to who were involved in the local anti-Vietnam War resistance as a major influence. And so he serves as that kind of bridge to that middle time. The Vietnam War was as unpopular here as it was in other places. There was less of a Vietnam War resistance here than in other places, but there was a resistance here, and it really started in 1968. The photo of the attractive young lady down there is Mary Burns. She was court-martialed in 1968. She joined the Marines thinking she could do some good in the world, kind of saw the way the war was going and the way the system worked, and just couldn't do it anymore. So she refused orders and refused to put on her uniform. She was court-martialed and kind of quietly dismissed from the military, but her court-martial was national news. At the same time, her brother was wanted for not signing up for the draft, and in 1968, he organized the first anti-Vietnam War protest, anti-draft protest, and it didn't go very well. Him and about 12 people showed up at the bus station at midnight, where about 50 inductees and their friends and family were getting them onto the bus and saying goodbye. And him and about 12 friends came in with a bunch of signs about opposing the Vietnam War and opposing the draft. And according to the newspaper article, they were essentially assaulted. And it's a shame that KREX's archives burned down, because the newspaper says KREX was there and filmed the whole thing, but all that footage has been lost to that fire. It starts to build from there. And after that, the movement really centers around the Bell Tower on Mesa State campus, and was very active from on campus from 1968 to 72, from teach-ins, protests, just free speech events where there'd be open mics where people veterans like Juan Espinoza, who were going to college on the GI Bill, were able to speak about what they had seen and what was going on in Vietnam. The local movement did include acts of civil disobedience. I can't really name names right now, but I do know that Tillman Bishop's office was broken into and draft records were burned, something that didn't make it into the newspapers, but I've talked to enough people that don't want to be named quite yet on that. And this Vietnam War resistance really kind of influenced things even to today. The Burns siblings, Timothy Burns and Mary Burns, it seems like they radicalized their dad, Larry Burns, because in the 1980s, he became really active with a group called Citizens Action for Peace, and they organized against nuclear proliferation. They organized with the Great Peace March of 1986, which was kind of like the Coxyites, a cross-country protest movement that came through Grand Junction, so they organized places for them to speak and for the hundreds of marchers to camp. This group was active. Citizens Action for Peace was active all the way up into the first Gulf War in 1991, where there was actually large protests here in Grand Junction at the federal building opposing the first Gulf War. And about that time, Citizens Action for Peace kind of morphed into Grand Valley Peace and Justice, which is still doing organizing stuff today and was a major part of opposing the Iraq War in the 2000s. Grand Junction's civil rights movement was very much a Chicano movement. They're the largest minority group in this area, and there was a number of predecessor organizations before the kind of like 1960s, 1970s Chicano movement. In the 1950s, a group called the GI Forum formed. It was all Chicano veterans, and it kind of worked as like a service group, something like a Kiwanis Club or a Rotary kind of club, but they found themselves kind of by default fighting some civil rights battles, namely on issues of police brutality, both here in Grand Junction and down in Montrose, and that was in the 1950s, so they were definitely ahead of their time. Groups like Child and Migrant Services, which went by a different name back then, kind of stepped in to try to fill the gap and help these people, and found themselves almost inevitably starting out being charitable, and pretty quickly found themselves having to fight for basic civil rights as well. Colorado Rural Legal Services also was a group that helped people access the legal system, and they ended up working a lot with migrant workers, migrant farmers, migrant herders, people like that, people that don't have much of a voice in the system. In September 1970, a man named Roy Otero led a walkout of Chicano students, and it kind of marked a new, more radical wing of the movement. And this movement, like a lot of these movements, they have kind of a branch that's more radical and a branch that's more mainstream. But the area between Montrose and here did have a number of groups of Brown Berets, which were kind of the Chicano equivalent of the Black Panther Party. The movement is still ongoing and has been working on stuff like police accountability, equal access to education, back in the day, support of the Coors boycott and the Cesar Chavez produce boycotts, and are still working on things like immigration and indigenous rights, cultural education, and we saw it in one of the biggest marches in Grand Junction history in 2006, which was a march for immigration reform. It had 4,000 plus people marching in the streets. Very much still a work in progress. I'm gonna explain some of the photos on this slide. The notice there that says, "Warning all Mexicans and all other aliens to leave the state of Colorado," was issued by Big Ed Johnson in the middle of the Great Depression. He illegally declared martial law, sent the Colorado National Guard to the southern border to prevent migrant workers coming from New Mexico to work both in the farms and in the sheep business and the herding business. Above that is a photo from 1980. There's a police killing of a Hispanic man named Jimmy Flores. It was kind of disputed what happened. The photo, if you can't read it, is graffiti that says "Killer Pigs Die," and it was graffitied inside the police officer's bedroom. So there was definitely a radical, revolutionary part of this movement that wasn't just going to wait around for change. The bottom photo is Juan and Deborah Espinoza. Juan was the editor of the Criterion at the time. He was a Vietnam vet. He was a part of the anti-war movement. And when he saw that 1970 student walkout go by Houston Hall, in an interview, he says he grabbed all his books without saying anything to the professor, grabbed his bag, ran out there and joined it. He knew that there was a Chicano movement, and he was just waiting for his opportunity to jump in and be involved. Pretty quickly thereafter, Juan and Deborah moved to Denver and were major players in the statewide Chicano movement. They started the first Spanish language newspaper on CU campus called El Dario, and then they went on to found La Cucaracha in Pueblo, which was a Spanish language activist-y newspaper that ran for about 15 years. Deborah went on to be the head of the museum down there in Pueblo for a number of years, and Juan went on to write for the Pueblo Chieftain for about 30 years. He was an excellent photographer, and he's often considered kind of like the photographer of the Colorado Chicano movement, and had documented a lot of the movement. Women have also existed in Grand Junction since the very beginning. Colorado was the first state that voted to grant women the right to vote in 1893. There wasn't really a huge movement here. A couple of the kind of major statewide organizers came through. There was a statewide women's newspaper called the Queen Bee that was distributed and did cover Grand Junction news. But there really wasn't much of a movement here. But women's suffrage was supported by the Republicans, the Populists, and almost everybody. And Mesa County passed women's suffrage by the largest percentage of any county in the state of Colorado in 1893. In the 1890s, and even before 1893, women were very active, but they weren't working on women's issues by and large. They were working on things like the Women's Library Association, which is why we have this awesome library I'm talking in. They also were very active in like the the Women's Christian Temperance Union and trying to push for prohibition. They were also involved in a lot of the different civic improvement things, like fundraising for the YMCA building, that kind of stuff. You see some people that were doing kind of feministy women's work, but they were very underground. I've uncovered and researched and written about a lady named Marie J. Ford, who moved to Junction in 1940 from the Aspen area. She was acquitted a number of times in the 1940s and 50s for performing abortions. She was charged again in 1960 and was found guilty of attempted abortion and given essentially no punishment. So it seemed like the county authorities were with like a nod and a wink saying, this is a needed service. In that trial from 1960, a number of doctors were called to testify, and they were actively referring patients to her decades before abortion was legal. So she's kind of like the Robin Hood of reproductive freedom here in Grand Junction. There was a lot of just tragic things that happened from 1880 till 1940, where you'd see articles about women dying from home abortions, women dying from poisoning, trying to use chemical-induced abortions. But from the date Marie J. Ford moved here, no more women were dying from botched abortions. And she kind of portends the modern, more feminist women's movement. The women's movement of the 70s really kind of got its start in the AAUW, that's the American Association of University Women, and with the League of Women Voters. And just like the Chicano movement, there was a number of predecessor organizations like Altrusa organization, which worked to kind of help train widows and newly divorced women to have some skills so they could go out there into the workforce and provide for their families. But the 1970s really saw an explosion of women's groups. From the National Organization of Women, locally there was the Women's Resource Center, and these different movements kind of cross-pollinated. And what Junction really brought to the women's movement nationally was a group called Voice that was started by a woman named Diane Carson. Voice stands for Victims of Incest Can Emerge, and it was a national organization of women who were victims of incest, working with each other and providing aid to each other and working on these issues and bringing more public awareness to it, which had to be an incredibly scary and gut-wrenching thing to do. But it still exists today. It's now called Voices, and when it left Grand Junction, they added that name change. But through the 80s and into the 90s, this national women's organization was headquartered here in Grand Junction. And then eventually in the early 80s, the Grand Junction Women's Clinic opened up, and Grand Junction at that point finally had legal abortion access here in the community. The bottom photo there, the color photo on this slide, is from the 2020 Women's March. And so it too is a movement that is ongoing. The environmental movement, we can look at a couple proto-environmentalists. We can kind of look at John Otto as a proto-environmentalist. He's the godfather of the National Monument. There was an early Humane Society, and the Humane Society worked with our Socialist City Council in 1911 and installed a horse water fountain in the dead center of 5th and Rood in the middle of the street, so the horses and the dogs could get water. There was an early Audubon Society here, and people like Teddy Roosevelt came to this area and hunted, and Teddy Roosevelt's kind of sportsman-based conservation was very much the predecessor to our modern environmental movements. In the mid-60s, we see kind of this lone voice, Howard Cottle, speaking up for animals and for the environment. He would run big full-page ads in the Sentinel opposing rodeos on grounds of animal cruelty, a heartily unpopular opinion in 1960s Grand Junction. He was a co-founder of the International Defenders of Animals, which was kind of seen as the more militant humane society. And he led like a single person campaign to save the Little Book Cliff wild horse herd, writing some 200 letters to editors of newspapers all over the country, making public comment at every public comment scouting event. And I want to read a quick thing, a letter to the editor of his 3 weeks before he died. And this letter to the editor was called Environmentalists Never Die. And just keep in mind, 3 weeks before he died, he wrote this: "Environmentalists never die. We just retire from the daily grind, buy ourselves a typewriter, roll up our sleeves, express even more concern and interest in our land, water, forests, and wildlife, and stand ready to battle against the greed and destruction which leaves a desolation in our land." So he kind of portended the environmental movement that we would see kind of come up in the early 70s. Another local event that really kind of got people activated, both in the environmental movement movement and in the anti-war movement was Project Rulison, where they tested a underground nuclear bomb just outside of Parachute. The top photo on this slide is from the Parachute newspaper at the time, showing a big cloud of dust coming off the mountain when the bomb was detonated. There was a number of protesters there, including Chester McQuarrie, on the mountain inside the exclusion zone, and they had already delayed the test for a couple days. Every time they started the countdown, these activists would pull these colored smoke bombs so the AEC would know that they were in the blast zone, and eventually they just detonated the bomb with them on top of the mountain. One person that really got activated out of that was a man named Chuck Worley out of Cedar Edge, and he would be a major part of like every environmental movement into the 2010s, into his 90s. And he was very, very much radicalized by this and activated by this nuclear bomb test. He would go on to do some acts of civil disobedience against the next nuclear bomb test in this area, Project Rio Blanco in 1972. The first Earth Day was celebrated here pretty widely in all the high schools and colleges. In the 70s, here, just like everywhere else, kind of saw this proliferation of environmental groups. In the early 70s, a group called Friends of the Earth moved into the area. They were a national group, but they did a lot of local grassroots organizing against oil shale development. In 79, we saw the Two River Citizens Association form. They were kind of being a watchdog group related to the uranium mill tailings cleanup here in town. And the bottom photo there, you see all those fine-looking hippies. That's 1980. That's Western Colorado Congress, which is now Western Colorado Alliance. And it brought together different grassroots environmental groups from around the region into a larger group to have a larger voice. And just like some of these other movements, there was some of these more radical elements. In the 1980s, when Earth First formed, one of their early rendezvous was held just outside of Nucla, and in the 2010s, another kind of blip of Earth First activity happened here, and there was a local Earth First group that supported the Utah tar sands resistance and carried out direct action campaign against the open tar sands mine that was proposed just a few miles on the Utah side of the border. Successfully, I might add. All right, gays and lesbians also have existed in Grand Junction since the beginning of time. Things have gotten better too. So when Colorado first became a territory, we picked up English common law. English common law had sodomy as a crime, punishable by death, though that didn't really happen much. In 1922, a Supreme Court case found that oral sex wasn't covered by sodomy, so Colorado had to pass its own law, the Crimes Against Nature law. And that law held that people could be basically indefinitely interned into the state psychiatric home for being gay or lesbian. And on like a local reference, I found an obscure local law from 1898, which banned cross-dressing. So you have to wonder what was going on in 1898. If I know anything about local governments, a law like that is targeting somebody. Are they trying to get those women who are working as cowboys to like put on dresses and become wives? Or is there, other things going on? I haven't really been able to figure that out. But the gay and lesbian community was always here. It was for most of the time, it's been an underground kind of community. The first really public acknowledgement that like gays and lesbians exist was a speech at Mesa State College in 1977. A woman named Morgan Ahern came and spoke about the joys of lesbianism. According to the newspaper article, a number of people came out publicly. A couple months later, the Gay Coalition was recognized on Mesa State campus in 1977. The cartoon that's in very poor taste comes from the Criterion right after the recognition of the Gay Coalition on campus. And in 1979, Quincy's becomes a gay bar. There's a love and relationship advice columnist in the Sentinel in 77, 78 that started getting a lot of letters from gay and lesbian folks going, we need a bar. And the theme of all these articles was like, somebody could make a lot of money opening a gay bar. In 1979, Quincy's became a gay bar, and that gave the community some space. And space often seems to help promote organizing. So the first gay and lesbian community-wide group was called the Gay and Lesbian Support Group, and they started in 1983, 1985. And one thing that's important to kind of talk about in these early groups was like the clear level of fear. Like the Gay and Lesbian Support Group had a P.O. box that you could write to then get the address to the meeting. The Gay Coalition didn't have any of the gay members ever at like the college meetings. They had straight representatives and spokespersons kind of handling their public appearances. And a lot of the stuff you can find in the newspaper from the early 80s really is very centric on hate crimes and stuff. And in fact, one of Grand Junction's oldest unsolved murders was a gay man that was murdered in 1979. And so the 80s 1970s, things started kind of happening. WestCap formed in 1985 as a kind of grassroots group that was providing support for people who were living with AIDS. In 1989, PFLAG started, which was Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And in about 1990 is kind of when the AIDS epidemic hit Grand Junction. The upper photo there is from the AIDS quilt for Derek Bruner. He was born and raised here, his parents lived here, and his death was really the first. He probably wasn't the first person in Mesa County to die of AIDS, but he was the first person to publicly pass away from AIDS. And his parents were very open. They talked to the newspapers about it, and they were also very involved in PFLAG and helping other parents and providing these support networks. Another young man that died just a couple weeks after Derek was Warren Mccarro. His dying wish was to have a foundation named after him. So the Warren Caro AIDS Foundation was formed, and its main goal was to provide comfort to people dying of AIDS. So they rented a large house on the Redlands with about 8 bedrooms. They had advocates and friends and people that were trained so that these people didn't die alone, and that was their guarantee. And they made it happen. Like, nobody died alone of AIDS in the Grand Valley. That's something I think we can be proud of. In 1992, Colorado passed Amendment 2, which made it legal statewide to discriminate against people in housing and in jobs for being gay or lesbian. Locally, that sparked the formation of the Common Decency Coalition, which fought against Amendment 2, and eventually Amendment 2 was overturned in a court case. But Common Decency Coalition would continue and kind of morphed into what is now Western Equality, that is still working on these issues today. WestCap is still working on these issues today. And the more we look, we kind of can find more stuff. I did do some interviews with people that were involved in the late 60s, early 70s gay community, and a lot of it was very much kind of a house party culture, very underground. There was a party house on Hill called the Hill House that was like a once a month party during the 60s and 70s. There was another man named Freddie Freak. Don't think it's his real name, but he was also organized about monthly parties at his house. And this comes from an interview with a man named Patrick Miles I did earlier this year. But they've always been here. We've always been here. And I'm going to talk about Black Lives Matter and right and wrong, and them being kind of the modern legacy of Elizabeth and Austin Taylor. You know, for small minority groups, in a lot of ways, kind of existence is resistance. We talk a lot about Handy Chapel and how important that is to the Black community. And it definitely is. It creates that space. I think I have a different take on the story, because if we look at the bigger context, in 1883, Town Marshal Crowley shot and killed a Black man named George Lewis. The circumstances were kind of contested. A number of Black women testified against the marshal. The marshal was cleared. At that time, the Black community would worship at the Methodist Church along with George Crawford and a lot of the town leaders. And just a couple months after the George Lewis shooting or killing, the town company deeds the land for Handy Chapel to the Black community, and William Austin and 2 other men apply for the AME membership. And then they spend the next 9 years having church in a vacant lot. So was the deeding of this lot to the Black community as generous as it is made out in most histories, or was it something, a cheap and easy way to kind of get the controversy out of your church? I don't think you'll ever be able to tell 100%, but I think you need to look at the context of that police killing, the number of Black women that testified against the police marshal, and so it's tough. But William Austin, his daughter would go on to do some really cool stuff in Salt Lake City and then move back here and do some really cool stuff here. And it's kind of crazy is that if you look at it, like the pre-World War I era was almost arguably more tolerant and more accepting than later decades. I would point to the hiring in 1904 of a black police officer in 1904 with zero controversy in the papers that you can find, like zero controversy. And then you can find civil rights commissions from the 1980s where multiple Black residents are complaining that they have worked as police officers in other states, they've applied numerous times and they haven't got a call back, and there was no officers of color on the police force in 1980. And there's a number of things like that, like there's court cases showing that Blacks were served in restaurants and bars in the teens, then all the oral histories starting in about 1920, Blacks were not served in restaurants and bars and hotels in this area. And sometimes when you're researching things like a lack of information is information, you look through the Green Book, which was a guide for Black travelers, There's not a listing in Grand Junction, not once, not since from when it started being published in the 40s until the 1960s, was there a restaurant or a hotel that would serve black people in Grand Junction. So something happened there, and I think it has a lot to do with kind of the KKK of the 20s, the loyalty leagues, and the Home Guard and the suppression in the 19-teens. But I want to talk about Elizabeth. Her dad was William Austin. In Salt Lake City, she married a man named William Taylor, and they started a newspaper called the Utah Plain Dealer, which was the first black newspaper in Utah. A number of local black community members were subscribers of it, and it served more than just the Utah population, but a lot of the spread out black communities out here in the West. She also formed a group called the Western Federation of Colored Women in 1904, about 13 years before the NAACP, and she had a big conference there in Salt Lake City that was addressed by the governor of Utah and by the mayor of Salt Lake City. Her husband was organizing black Mason lodges that were all black Masonic lodges, and Elizabeth and her husband would travel here to Grand Junction during the early 1900s. He would work on setting up the Masons Lodge, and she would hold meetings of her Western Federation of Colored Women. Lizzie's husband would eventually die, and in late 1910 or early 1911, Elizabeth Austin Taylor moves back to Grand Junction. If you're familiar at all with like the KKK history, they often note that the KKK had nailed a letter to a black family's door demanding that they leave town. This was Elizabeth Taylor's door. She did not leave town, and she served the Handy Chapel for about a dozen years as the minister. One of her kids would go on to minister as well at the Handy Chapel, and her granddaughter is Josephine Dickey, who is often quoted and is in many ways the godmother of the modern black community. Oral histories held by the library here with Shan Robinson speak to this fact that Josephine Dickey was kind of the godmother of the whole black community. Josephine Dickey, which would be Elizabeth Ann Austin Taylor's granddaughter, and it's kind of cool, you can trace this all the way back to her activist grandma, to her, to even the black activists today. It's a pretty direct line. But Josephine Dickey helped found the Grand Junction chapter of the NAACP, which was in response to a very forgotten chapter called the Black Rapist Investigations. There was a number of reports of a black rapist, and during that 2-year period of 1978 to 1980, literally every single black man in this town got hauled in on some sort of charge that would require fingerprints and DNA testing to try to solve it. Then NAACP got involved and investigated, and it really led to both the local chapter and some federal civil rights hearings in this area. That's also when like the annual Martin Luther King Day March memorial started that goes from City Hall to Handy Chapel. And Josephine Dickey was there, and her great-granddad was there when they got deeded the land. So that history is really cool and really plays in directly with people like Shannon Robinson, who helped organize the 2020 George Floyd protests here, which was one of the more sustained, large, progressive protest movements I've seen in this town. And we gotta thank her. Just like in the Vietnam War, the Iraq War opposition saw like a new boom of community organizing. This is part of the story that I have a little more personal ties to, but A Voice of Reason with Grand Valley Peace and Justice from an earlier slide started organizing the anti-war protests and movements here in Grand Junction. And from that, a lot of young people, including myself, had gotten involved. And from the war, we saw just a proliferation of grassroots community organizing take place out of those kind of networks of resistance. Like we organized against the war together, and then we organized Housing First, No More Deaths, and organized with homeless people to find solutions a couple of years later. We all, people involved with the anti-war movement were involved with Occupy GJ, Confluence Media Collective, Solidarity Not Charity, which still exists, working with homeless folks. So, just like the 60s and the Vietnam protests kind of saw the proliferation of the new left and different political movements, so too did the Iraq War organizing. And Junction really did have a pretty sustained, loud anti-war movement. The 6th year of the Iraq War was after Obama got elected, and Grand Junction was the only city in the whole state that still had a protest against the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because they didn't just end. And these networks of resistance were really crucial in first-person point of view. And when I started Grand Junction Mutual Aid at the beginning of the pandemic, I was able to call on like a couple dozen people that I had worked with and organized with before. And within a couple days, we had 15,000 people in the main group, and that organization is still out there doing good things. Me personally, I kind of think like history not applied is just storytelling, so I kind of want to tease out some things that we can learn from all this. There's something that sociologists call the radical flank effect. This is something that says without Malcolm X, nobody was going to talk to Martin Luther King, or at least somebody that's more radical like Malcolm X makes negotiating and working with Martin Luther King a lot more palatable for those in power. And we see that a lot, even from Gleeser in 1881. He kind of identified more as an anarchist, like a traditional, not skateboard kid in spray paint, but like a traditional kind of like European anarchist that believed in anarcho-syndicalism. And you saw him being a lead organizer in a more conservative group like the Knights of Labor, but those people have to be there to push, or else nothing ever really moves forward. And we see that in almost all these movements, that there's somebody that's the first one through the door, who's got a crazy idea like Coxey, like let's put unemployed people to work to build new roads. And so I think if we want to see social movements succeed here, we gotta maybe not support the radicals, but not undercut them and don't backstab them. Oftentimes, people lose the battle and win the war. The Coxeyite movement did not succeed in 1894, but during the Great Depression in the 1930s, FDR was able to pull on some of those ideas of public works and putting unemployed men to work to great effect to pull us out of the Great Depression. You see that with Housing First, No More Deaths. I mean, we were asking for the moon, like no more homelessness, put people in houses now, all of them. We knew we weren't going to get that, but we did get the debate going on things that got the ball rolling to create more services and fill in where we do have gaps. Another kind of theme that I found is there's always a kind of progressive brain drain. From Gleeser in 1881 to people I worked with in 2020 on the George Floyd protests, a lot of young activists and organizers seem to leave Grand Junction. And if we want to make long-term social change here, we should try to find a way to stop that. And I don't know what that looks like, what kind of intervention points there are there, but people have businesses. Give these young activists jobs so they can afford to live here. I think one of the other big ones is that strong movements create space. Movements that have physical space seem to get bigger and proliferate. So we saw, like in the Chicano movement, they started a community center called Vox de la Raza. The Knights of Labor had their labor hall that was open to everybody and they could come and read. The International Workers of the World, when they had a local here, was the meeting hall for a bunch of other smaller unions. You see, you had in play with the Women's Resource Center, where people that were volunteering with the Women's Resource Center then started creating other side projects that built on it, and that's really what a movement takes. You see it even with Quincy's, when Quincy's was a gay bar, or Handy Chapel, a space that brings a community together ends up being these spaces where communities can build resistance. Movements also need to create intellectual space, or strong movements create intellectual space. So that's things like newspapers. So like the Populists had a newspaper, the Socialists had a newspaper. That can also be like newsletters, online forums and stuff, but it creates this intellectual space where new ideas can be debated and hashed out and implemented and refined. And also strong movements create social space, events that are not necessarily political in nature, but just build community or educate or give pride to one's culture. And the Chicano movement does this really well with Cinco de Mayo celebrations and other celebrations that don't seem overtly political, but they bring the people in the movement together and bring in people from outside the movement to interact with them, and that always has ongoing kind of positive effects for movements. So people who are building movements or thinking about movements, think about creating these spaces, this physical space, intellectual space, and social space. In terms of space, I want to talk about this one quote. This was a columnist with the Sentinel named Jim Moorhead. 20 years after the fact, I talked a little bit about George Falconer and his bookstore. This is 20 years after Falconer left town. Jim Moorhead writes, "How well I remember George Falconer's little bookshop on Main Street a score of years ago. It did not require his recent letter to the editor to recall to mind his gentle philosophy of protest, his thoughtful, somewhat bookish mannerisms, and his altogether lovable eagerness. I hoped for many years of peace and contentment for a man who could differ as widely and as sweetly as any I've known." So I really like these kind of quotes like that because it shows how movements are built upon each other and how this man left Grand Junction 20 years ago, and his ideas and his sense of community and his person and his space he created for people is still living on in people's memory. And that's another good point, is that movements are built upon each other. You create space for the next generation activists when you push on an issue. I want to thank you guys for listening to me. I want to thank again the library for giving me this opportunity. This last photo, I think, has a lot of big picture stuff on it. This photo was taken during the 1894 Pullman strike. The men with rifles there in the photo are recently deputized marshals. A lot of the ladies in the nice fine clothes, they're passengers who are stranded in Grand Junction because the strike has brought rail traffic to a grinding halt. And some of them in the photo are also some of the strikers and a baseball team from Leadville. And while the trains were stopped and other places were devolving into full-on chaos, in Junction, the Leadville baseball team played the strikers and the marshals. And now they're all posing. These are people that are heavily inconvenienced by the shutting down of the rail, marshals holding guns on them, and the strikers, and they're all taking time to pose together for a photo. And I think that is a decent message that we can figure it out the day to day. So thank you so much.